Clara Bennington had heard the rumor 3 times before she believed it, and even then she did not believe it kindly. The Duke of Rothmere, it was said, intended to marry, but not in the ordinary way, not through balls and calling cards and the slow, dignified courtship that had governed every match in England since matches had existed. He intended to summon 50 women to his estate, one after another, and study them the way a breeder studies horses, until he found the one worth keeping. Clara had laughed when she first heard it, a short, disbelieving laugh, because surely no man, however wealthy, however titled, could be so arrogant as to treat marriage like an auction of flesh and manners. But her aunt had not laughed. Her aunt had written her name on the list. "You will go," Lady Prescott said, folding the letter with the finality of a woman closing a ledger. "You will go, and you will conduct yourself as though your future depended upon it." Because it does. Clara stood very still in the drawing-room, her hands folded in front of her plain grey dress, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the way it always did when her aunt spoke of money. There was a debt. There was always a debt, ever since her father died, and left nothing behind but affection and unpaid accounts. And Lady Prescott had taken her in not from love but from duty, and reminded her of the distinction often. Now it seemed Clara's face and her manners and whatever remained of her dwindling dowry were to be offered up at Rothmere Hall like a card played in a game she had never agreed to enter. "I will not be chosen," Clara said, and there was no self-pity in it, only fact. "There will be 50 women there, aunt, younger women, prettier women, women whose fathers left them fortunes instead of debts." "You will not be chosen," Lady Prescott agreed, without cruelty, because cruelty required more energy than her aunt cared to spend. "But you will be seen. And there are men there, cousins, second sons, men of standing, who attend such gatherings to watch which way the wind blows. If the Duke does not want you, someone else may." It was, Clara understood, not a request. It had not been a request since the day her father's creditors came calling, and Lady Prescott had taken her in with the particular chill of a woman performing an obligation she resented. So 3 days later, Clara found herself in a hired carriage, jolting along a road toward Rothmere Hall, watching the countryside change from familiar hedgerows to something grander, colder, more deliberately beautiful, as though the land itself had been groomed to reflect its owner's consequence. She arrived a full day before the other candidates were expected, a detail she would later understand mattered more than she could have guessed, though at the time it felt only like an inconvenience, a mistake in her aunt's correspondence, an error in the dates. Leaving Clara to be shown not into the grand receiving hall, but into a modest sitting room, told to wait, and largely forgotten by a household consumed with preparations for the following day's spectacle. Restless and unwilling to sit obediently in a room that smelled of beeswax and old ambition, Clara slipped out through a side door into the gardens. Drawn by the smell of rain on stone and the promise of air that did not carry the scent of her aunt's disapproval, the gardens at Rothmere were vast, terraced, half wild in the way that only very old money could afford to be careless. And she walked without direction until she found herself near the stables, where a man in shirt-sleeves was speaking low and steady to a black horse that did not want to be spoken to. He did not look like a duke. That much she would tell herself later, again and again, as though repeating it might excuse what she said next. His coat was plain, his sleeves rolled, his hands roughened in a way that suggested labor rather than leisure, and there was a quiet, unhurried competence in the way he moved that she associated, unthinkingly, with men who worked for their bread, rather than men who inherited it. She assumed, without asking, that he was a steward, or a groom risen to some trusted position, and she spoke to him the way she would have spoken to no one of consequence, which is to say, "Honestly, I am told," she said, coming to lean against the fence rail, that your master intends to interview 50 women as though he were purchasing carriage horses. Is that true, or is it merely the sort of story servants invent to entertain themselves at their employer's expense? The man turned. His eyes were a pale, startling grey, and something in them sharpened with an interest she mistook for simple curiosity. "It is true," he said, "though I could not say whether 50 is the precise number, or whether the metaphor of carriage horses is entirely fair to the horses." Clara laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "No," she agreed. "Horses at least are not expected to pretend they enjoy being examined." "And you believe the ladies will pretend?" "I believe," she said, "that any woman with sense enough to attend such a gathering will understand precisely what is required of her, and will perform it beautifully, and will hate every moment of it, and will call it good fortune if she is chosen, because good fortune is what we are taught to call the absence of choice." She heard her own bitterness and, embarrassed, softened it. "Forgive me. I do not know your Duke, and I ought not to judge a man I have never met." "You judge him rather thoroughly for a man you have never met," the stranger said, and there was something in his voice she could not read, not offence precisely, but a kind of careful attention, as though he were memorizing her. "I judge the practice," Clara said, "not necessarily the man. Perhaps he is lonely. Perhaps he has been advised poorly. Perhaps he genuinely believes there is no better way to find a wife than to treat courtship like a military inspection. I do not know him well enough to say whether he is cruel or merely foolish. I know only that I would rather remain unmarried the whole of my life than be made to curtsy for a man who cannot be bothered to court me properly." "And yet you have come," the man said quietly. Clara's cheeks warmed. "I have come because my aunt commanded it, and because there is a debt in my family that a fortunate marriage might settle, and because I am 24 and unmarried and considered, by every reasonable measure, to be running out of time. I have not come because I admire the arrangement. I have come because I have very little choice in the matter, which I suspect is true of a great many women on your master's list, whatever face we put on it tomorrow." The stranger was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along the horse's neck, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, gone lower and more careful. "If that is true," he said, "then he is a fool indeed, to gather 50 women who did not wish to come, and imagine he will find among them one who came for him." "Perhaps," Clara said, straightening, suddenly aware that the light was fading, and that she had been standing far too long in conversation with a man whose name she had not asked, "he will find that the woman worth choosing is the one who tells him so to his face, rather than the one who tells him what he wishes to hear." She dropped a small, unbothered curtsy, more out of habit than respect. "Good evening. I hope your master proves wiser than his method suggests." She did not see the way he watched her walk back toward the house, nor the faint, unfamiliar softness that crossed his face before he schooled it away, nor the way he said, very quietly, to the horse who could not repeat it to anyone, "I begin to hope so myself." That night, Clara did not learn the stranger's name, and by morning, dressed in her one good gown of dove-grey silk, standing among a crowd of women whose jewels alone could have paid her aunt's debts twice over, she had almost convinced herself the conversation had been a small, private mercy, a moment of honesty before the performance began, and nothing more. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong for many days yet. Rothmere Hall filled that morning with a kind of glittering dread. 50 women. Clara counted them without meaning to, the way one counts stairs in the dark, arranged themselves in the long gallery beneath rows of ancestral portraits, each face above them stern and disapproving, as though the dead Rothmeres themselves had come to judge the living contest below. There was Lady Featherstone's daughter, Miranda, golden-haired and diamond-bright, already holding court among a cluster of admiring mothers. There were younger sisters pushed forward by ambitious families, older daughters growing desperate poor relations like Clara herself, standing at the edges where the light did not quite reach. The Duke, when he finally appeared, entered through a side door with none of the ceremony Clara had expected, and she felt the room's collective breath catch before she even lifted her eyes to see why. It was him, the man from the stables, the man in shirt-sleeves who had spoken to her of horses and honesty, now dressed in dark, exquisitely tailored blue, his grey eyes moving over the assembled women with a composure so complete it bordered on coldness, until they found her, standing near the back of the gallery in her plain grey gown, and something in his expression flickered, just once, before he mastered it. Clara felt the floor tilt again, worse than it had in her aunt's drawing-room, worse than anything her aunt's debts had ever done to her. She had insulted him. Not cruelly, not viciously, but thoroughly honestly to his face, believing him a servant, and he had let her. He had stood there in his shirt-sleeves and allowed her to call his entire courtship scheme foolish and cold, and said nothing to correct her. And now he stood before 50 women in his own gallery, a duke in truth, and she understood with sickening clarity that she had already made her first impression, and it could not be unmade. "Ladies," the Duke said, and his voice was the same voice from the stables, low and even, though now it carried the weight of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I thank you for accepting my invitation, though I suspect thanks are premature, given how few of you accepted it freely." A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the gallery. Clara did not laugh. She was watching him, waiting for some sign that he intended to expose her, to call her forward and demand she repeat, before this glittering assembly, everything she had said the night before about horses and inspections and men who could not be bothered to court properly. But he did not look at her again. He addressed the room instead, explaining, with a formality that could not entirely disguise the discomfort beneath it, that each lady present would be granted, over the coming days, several occasions to speak with him, to be observed in company, to reveal, through conversation and conduct, rather than through practiced performance, some genuine measure of her character. "I have been told," the Duke said, and here, for the briefest moment, his eyes moved back to Clara before sliding away, that a woman's true nature is rarely visible in a ballroom, where every gesture has been rehearsed since the cradle. "I hope, in the days ahead, to see past the rehearsal." Clara's heart was beating very fast. She did not know then that he had spoken those words for her alone, that her honesty in the stable yard had unsettled something in him that 3 years of careful, guarded coldness had failed to touch. She knew only that she stood in a gallery full of women more beautiful, more moneyed, more polished than herself, having already, through her own unguarded tongue, either ruined her chances entirely, or, though she could not yet imagine how, done something far more dangerous. The days that followed unfolded like a slow, formal dance, whose steps Clara did not know. There were teas in the orangery, where the Duke moved among the ladies with careful, distributed attention, never lingering long enough to raise talk, though Clara noticed, because she could not help but notice, that his eyes found her more often than propriety strictly required. There were walks in the garden, arranged in rotating pairs, where Miranda Featherstone attached herself to the Duke's side with a determination that bordered on strategy, laughing at things that were not amusing, touching his sleeve with a familiarity Clara found herself, unwillingly, resenting. "You are staring," said a voice beside her one afternoon, and Clara turned to find a young woman named Susanna Hale, whom she had met over tea and liked instantly for her lack of pretension, watching her with open amusement. "I am not staring," Clara said, though she had been. "You are staring at Miss Featherstone staring at the Duke," Susanna said, "which is nearly the same thing, only more complicated." "I do not care who the Duke marries," Clara said, with more force than the statement required, and Susanna's eyebrows rose in a way that told Clara she had not been believed, and told Clara, more uncomfortably, that she had not entirely believed herself either. It was 3 days into the gathering when Clara was finally granted her formal audience with the Duke, a private half-hour in the library, a courtesy extended to every lady in turn, though the ladies who had already endured it returned with widely varying reports. Some emerged flushed and pleased, certain they had charmed him. Others emerged pale and uncertain, unable to say what had passed between them. Clara walked to the library with her heart hammering, rehearsing apologies she was not certain she wished to make, and found the Duke standing near the tall windows, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the gardens where, 3 nights before, she had spoken so freely to a man she believed, beneath her notice. "Miss Bennington," he said, without turning, "I wondered whether you would attend at all, or whether you would send word that you had reconsidered the entire enterprise." "I considered it," Clara admitted, "because there seemed no purpose in pretending otherwise. Not with him, not after the stable yard. But I did not think it fair to withdraw without first apologizing for the things I said to you, believing you a groom." He turned then, and there was something unreadable in his face, something that was not quite amusement and not quite offense. "You need not apologize," he said. "You said nothing to a groom that you would not say to a duke, which I confess I have found rather more interesting than offensive. You allowed me to believe you were someone else." "I did not correct a mistaken assumption," he said carefully. "There is a difference, though I understand you may not agree it is a meaningful one." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, equal parts anger, and something far less comfortable. "It is a very great difference, Your Grace. A groom who allows a lady to insult his employer is showing discretion. A duke who allows a lady to insult himself, and says nothing, is conducting an experiment." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed, as though she had struck closer to the truth than he had expected any of his 50 guests to reach. "Perhaps I was," he admitted, after a silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. "I had grown tired, Miss Bennington, of being told only what people believed I wished to hear. I wished for one evening to hear what a stranger truly thought, unburdened by my title. You gave me that. I did not anticipate how much I would value it." "And now?" Clara asked, unable to keep the challenge from her voice. "Now that I know who you are, will I be permitted to speak honestly, or must I curtsy and agree with everything you say, like the rest of your 50 ladies?" "I would be disappointed," the Duke said, and there was, unmistakably now, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, "if you began agreeing with me at this late stage. It would rather spoil the character I have already formed of you." They spoke for the remainder of the half-hour of things that did not, on their surface, matter, books, the gardens, the strange formality of the gathering itself. But Clara left the library with the unsettling awareness that she had been more honest with the Duke of Rothmere in 30 minutes than she had been with anyone since her father died, and that he had listened to her, truly listened, in a way she had not realized she was starving for, until it was given to her. She did not know, could not have known, that behind his composed grey eyes the Duke was fighting a battle of his own, that 3 years before he had stood in a church half-dressed for his own wedding and learned, from a hastily delivered letter, that his intended bride had chosen, at the final hour, a wealthier and less complicated man, that the humiliation of that morning had calcified into a private, guarded coldness his household had learned never to test, that his father, dying 18 months later, had extracted a promise that his son marry and secure the line before his 30th birthday, a birthday now less than 4 months away, and that the whole elaborate, uncomfortable spectacle of 50 ladies gathered beneath his ancestors' painted disapproval had been born not of arrogance, as Clara had assumed, but of a wounded man's desperate attempt to find sincerity through a method that could not be gained by beauty or ambition alone. He did not tell her any of this. Not yet. It was far too soon, and he had been burned too badly to hand his history to a woman he had known for 4 days, however honest her eyes. But he found himself, in the days that followed, arranging his schedule so that Clara's turns in the garden fell nearer his own free hours, seating her, without seeming to notice he had done so, within easier conversation at dinner, and watching, always watching the small, unrehearsed things she did when she believed no one of consequence observed her, the gentle way she spoke to the housemaids, the quiet kindness she showed to Susanna Hale when the other ladies excluded her, the fierce private pride with which she wore her one good gown a second and third time, rather than borrow finery she could not afford, as though daring the assembled company to judge her for it. Miranda Featherstone noticed the Duke's attention long before Clara allowed herself to believe in it, and Miranda Featherstone, who had been raised from the cradle to expect that beauty and breeding entitled her to whatever she desired, did not intend to lose a dukedom to a poor relation in a borrowed carriage. "You have made a friend of Miss Bennington," Miranda said one evening, settling beside Clara on a garden bench with the deliberate grace of a woman choosing her battlefield. "How fortunate for you." His Grace seems quite taken with her honesty. "I had not noticed," Clara said, which was, by now, a lie, and she suspected Miranda knew it. "Of course you had not." Miranda's smile did not reach her eyes. "But you must understand, Miss Bennington, that men in his position rarely marry for honesty. They marry for connection, for fortune, for the kind of alliance that strengthens a family, rather than merely amusing it for a season. Whatever charm you have shown him, I think you will find it is a passing curiosity, not a foundation. Dukes do not build their houses on curiosities." Clara said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not betray how deeply the words had struck, and Miranda, satisfied, rose and drifted back toward the house, leaving Clara alone with the cold, familiar certainty that she had allowed herself, foolishly, to hope. The hope did not die easily, though. It rarely does, once it has been fed even a little. 2 days later, a sudden summer storm trapped several of the ladies, Clara among them, in the orangery, as rain hammered the glass roof and turned the gardens beyond into grey, streaming shadow. The Duke arrived to check on his guests, as a proper host should, and found most of the ladies gathered near the far end, complaining prettily of ruined slippers and delayed carriages, while Clara stood alone near the glass, watching the storm with an expression of open, unguarded pleasure that made him stop in the doorway before anyone noticed him there. "You do not mind the rain," he observed, coming to stand near her, close enough that she was newly, sharply aware of him. "I have always liked storms," Clara admitted. "My father used to say that a storm was simply the world being honest about how it felt, all at once, instead of pretending calm it did not possess. I found that a comforting thought, as a child. I find it comforting still." "Your father sounds as though he understood a great deal." "He understood everything except money," Clara said. "And there was no bitterness in it now, only a soft old grief, which is why I am here, Your Grace, being examined alongside 49 other women, instead of at home, being merely myself." "I would have thought," the Duke said quietly, "that being merely yourself was precisely what has recommended you to me." Clara turned to look at him then, startled, and found his grey eyes steady on hers. None of the guarded coldness she had grown accustomed to seeing him wear like armor before the other ladies. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the rain filled the silence, and something passed between them that Clara would spend the following nights trying, unsuccessfully, not to think about. "You should not say such things to me," she said finally, softly. "Not when there are 49 other women in this house who would give a great deal to hear them instead. I have said them to no one but you, he said, and it was, she realized with a shock that went straight through her, entirely true. It was that night, lying awake in the narrow guest bedroom she had been given at the end of an unfashionable corridor, that Clara allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine what it might be to be chosen, not as a debt settled or a duty discharged, but as a woman genuinely wanted. The imagining frightened her more than the storm had, because hope, she knew from long experience, was a debt of its own, collected cruelly when it went unpaid. She was right to fear it, though not for the reasons she expected. The blow, when it came from Miranda Featherstone, and it came dressed in the appearance of concern. I thought you ought to know, Miranda said, cornering Clara in the corridor outside the breakfast room 3 mornings later, her voice pitched low and confiding, though her eyes glittered with something far less sympathetic, that His Grace has spoken to my mother of the arrangements. He has all but settled the matter, Miss Bennington. I am told the announcement will come within the week. She paused, watching Clara's face with evident satisfaction. I did not wish you to be caught unaware, given how attentive you have allowed yourself to become. Clara felt the words land like a physical blow, though she kept her face composed through sheer force of will. I have no claim on His Grace's attention, she said, with more steadiness than she felt. He is free to settle the matter however he chooses. How gracious of you, Miranda said, and swept past her toward the breakfast room, leaving Clara standing alone in the corridor, her hands pressed flat against her skirts to keep them from trembling. She told herself, in the hours that followed, that she had known this outcome was likely from the beginning, that a duke did not, in the end, choose a poor relation with an unpaid family debt over a woman of Miranda Featherstone's fortune and connection, whatever pretty things he said about honesty in the rain. She told herself she had been foolish to hope, and that the fault was entirely her own. And by the time evening came, she had built, brick by brick, a wall around the soft, unguarded place his attention had touched. She did not know, because Miranda had been careful to ensure she would not know, that no such conversation with Lady Featherstone had ever occurred, that Miranda had invented the entire exchange from nothing but her own ambition and her own fear. Watching the Duke's grey eyes follow Clara Bennington across every room they shared and understanding, with the clear-eyed ruthlessness of a woman who intended to win, that honesty alone would not defeat her rival. A lie would have to do the work instead. The lie worked precisely as Miranda had intended. Clara at dinner that evening was cool and distant where she had been warm, answered the Duke's questions with careful, guarded politeness where she had once spoken freely, and excused herself early, pleading a headache that was not entirely untrue, though its cause had nothing to do with her constitution and everything to do with her heart. The Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. He had spent a week learning to read every small change in her, and this change was neither small nor subtle. He spent that night in his study long after the household had retired, staring at correspondence he did not read, turning over in his mind every word he had spoken to her in the orangery, wondering whether he had, in his own clumsy way, frightened her, whether he had moved too quickly for a woman who had learned, through hard experience, to distrust anything that looked too much like good fortune. He did not know about Miranda's lie. He would not know for several more days, and in the space of that ignorance, the careful, fragile thing growing between himself and Clara Bennington nearly withered entirely. It was Susanna Hale in the end who broke the silence, though she did not intend to play the part of rescuer when she sought Clara out in the garden 2 mornings later and found her sitting alone beneath the old oak near the fountain, her eyes red-rimmed in a way she had clearly hoped no one would notice. "You have been avoiding him," Susanna said, settling onto the stone bench beside her without invitation. In the easy manner of a woman who had decided friendship excused a certain bluntness. "And do not tell me it is a headache, Clara, because I have watched you avoid 3 separate opportunities to speak with him in as many days. And a headache does not last that long without a physician being summoned. Clara said nothing for a long moment, staring at the fountain's slow, indifferent water. Miranda told me the arrangement has been settled, she said finally, quietly, that the Duke has spoken to her mother, that the announcement will come within the week. Susanna's eyebrows drew together. That cannot be true. Why not? Because I was with Miranda's maid not 2 hours ago, mending a torn hem, and the girl let slip that Lady Featherstone has been growing increasingly impatient, wondering aloud why the Duke has shown her daughter so little particular attention, when Miranda assured her before they ever arrived that the match was as good as made. Susanna's voice had dropped, urgent now. Clara, I do not think Miranda spoke to her mother of any arrangement, because I do not think there was one to speak of. I think she told you a story to frighten you away. Clara's breath caught. She thought of Miranda's glittering, satisfied eyes in the corridor, the careful timing of the revelation, delivered just after a night in the orangery that had left Clara more hopeful than she had allowed herself to be in years. She thought, too, of the sudden, wounded coolness she had shown the Duke since. The careful distance she had built without ever asking him a single question, without ever giving him the chance to deny it. I have been a fool, she said softly. You have been frightened, Susanna corrected gently. There is a difference. Though I understand you may not currently agree, it is a meaningful one. The echo of the Duke's own words, though Susanna could not have known it, struck Clara with sudden, painful clarity, and she rose from the bench with a new, urgent purpose. She did not find the Duke that morning, nor that afternoon, for he had been called away on estate business that could not wait, and by the time he returned, weary and preoccupied, the household had already begun to whisper of a fresh disturbance, a disturbance that would prove, in the end, far more dangerous to Clara's hopes than any lie Miranda Featherstone had told. Lady Prescott had arrived. Clara's aunt swept into Rothmere Hall 2 days ahead of the gathering's planned conclusion, summoned, she claimed, by news that had reached her through friends in the county, news that her niece had attracted the Duke's particular notice, and that the moment had come to press whatever small advantage the family possessed before it slipped away. She found Clara in the sitting room she had been given, and her greeting carried none of the warmth an aunt might reasonably be expected to show a niece, who had, by all accounts, done rather well for herself. I am told the Duke favours you, Lady Prescott said, without preamble, settling into a chair with the brisk efficiency of a woman with limited patience for sentiment. You will not waste this, Clara. Do you understand me? Whatever affection he has shown you, you will encourage it, and you will encourage it quickly, because the debt your father left behind will not settle itself, and I have not the means to support you indefinitely. I have not encouraged anything, Aunt, Clara said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, given how thoroughly she had, in fact, allowed herself to hope. And I will not pursue a man's affection as though it were a debt to be collected. You will do precisely as I instruct, Lady Prescott said, and there was a new, harder edge in her voice now, one Clara had heard before. In the weeks after her father's death, when her aunt's patience for grief had run its short course, I have arranged, in the event this match does not settle, an alternative. Mr. Barrow of Ashcombe has expressed willingness to take you, debt and all, if I can present the match before Michaelmas. He is not young, and he is not kind, by all reports, but he is solvent. And solvency, Clara, is not a luxury we can afford to disdain. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. You would marry me to a stranger rather than allow me even the chance to be genuinely chosen? I would marry you to whoever settles the debt, Lady Prescott said, without apology, because I have carried the burden of your father's failures for 6 years, and I am tired, Clara. Tired in a way you cannot yet understand, and I will not carry it a day longer than I must. She rose, smoothing her skirts. You have until the gathering's end to secure the Duke's offer. If it does not come, you will accept Mr. Barrows, and you will do so with grace, because grace is the only inheritance your father left you that anyone has ever found useful. The conversation left Clara shaking, torn between the fresh, fragile hope Susanna had restored and the cold, familiar dread of a fate decided entirely by other people's convenience. She did not know, as she sat alone that evening turning her aunt's words over and over, that Lady Prescott had made no secret of her visit or her demands to the household staff, several of whom carried the story, embellished with every retelling, to other ears within the hour, including, eventually, to Miranda Featherstone, who received it with the particular delight of a woman handed an unexpected weapon. How very sad, Miranda said to her mother that evening, within careful earshot of several other guests, that Miss Bennington's family should be so pressed for funds that they have already arranged a match with some tradesman in Ashcombe, in case His Grace does not oblige them. One wonders whether her attentions to the Duke have been sincere at all, or whether she has simply been securing whichever offer arrives first. The words, carried and recarried through the house with the efficiency gossip always commanded, reached the Duke by breakfast the following morning, delivered by his own aunt, Lady Wexford, who had come to oversee the gathering's final days, and who regarded the entire enterprise with an old woman's weary skepticism. They are saying, Lady Wexford told him over coffee, watching his face carefully, that Miss Bennington is already promised elsewhere, to some man of business in Ashcombe, and that whatever warmth she has shown you has been merely a hedge against disappointment. I do not know whether it is true, Julian, but I thought you would wish to know it is being said. The Duke set down his cup very carefully, aware of the sudden cold tightening in his chest, the old wound, the one Cordelia had left 3 years before, reopening with vicious speed at the suggestion that he had once again been made a fool of by a woman weighing him against a more convenient offer. He told himself he did not believe it. He told himself in the same breath that he had believed Cordelia too, until the letter came. He sought Clara out that afternoon, and found her in the library, and his manner, when he spoke, carried a coldness she had not heard from him since the very first day of the gathering, when he had stood before 50 women and spoken of rehearsed gestures with careful, guarded distance. I am told, he said, without preamble, that your family has already arranged a match, in the event mine does not suit you. I would ask you to confirm or deny it, Miss Bennington, and I would ask you to do so honestly, since honesty is the quality you have so often claimed to value above all others. Clara felt the words strike like a slap, doubly painful for how close to true they were. My aunt has proposed such a match, she admitted, because she would not lie to him, whatever it cost her. I have not agreed to it. I have told her I will not agree to it. But I cannot deny that it exists, Your Grace, because it does, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. And yet, you did not tell me, the Duke said, and there was real hurt beneath the coldness now. Hurt he could not entirely disguise. You allowed me to believe your affection was freely given, while your family arranged your future behind my back. I did not tell you, Clara said, her own voice rising now, wounded and furious in equal measure, because it is not yours to know every private humiliation my family has visited upon me. I did not tell you because I hoped, foolishly, that it would never come to matter, that you would choose me or you would not, and either way I would be spared the indignity of explaining that my aunt considers me a debt to be settled, rather than a woman to be loved. I did not tell you, Your Grace, because I was ashamed, and I did not think shame was something I owed you an accounting of, simply because you are a duke. They stood facing each other in the library, the same room where he had first admitted, days before, that he valued her honesty above all things, and now that honesty stood between them like a wound neither knew how to close. I have been made a fool once before, the Duke said finally quietly, by a woman who weighed me against a wealthier offer and found me wanting until the moment it suited her otherwise. I will not be made a fool twice. I never asked you to trust me blindly, Clara said, her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall in front of him. I asked for nothing at all, Your Grace, because I understood from the very beginning that I had no right to, but I will not be compared to whatever woman wounded you, simply because my aunt is desperate and I am poor. If you cannot separate the two, then perhaps it is well that we discovered it now, before either of us mistook this for something it was never going to be. She left him standing alone in the library, and if he had looked closely enough, he might have seen that her hands were shaking as badly as his own. The days that followed passed in a strange, brittle silence. The Duke conducted the gathering's final formal events, with the same careful distribution of attention he had shown from the beginning. But something in him had gone cold and distant, and Clara, for her part, retreated into a quiet, dignified reserve that fooled everyone except Susanna Hale, who watched her friend move through the final days of the gathering like a woman holding herself together through will alone. It was Lady Wexford, in the end, who unravelled the truth, not from any particular fondness for Clara Bennington, whom she barely knew, but from a lifetime's habit of distrusting gossip that arrived too neatly packaged. She sought out Miranda's maid, the same girl who had let slip the truth to Susanna days before, and pressed her, gently but firmly, until the whole scheme emerged. Miranda's invented conversation about a settled arrangement, designed to frighten Clara into cold retreat, and, more damning still, Miranda's own hand in spreading the story of Mr. Barrow's proposal, exaggerated and reshaped until it sounded like Clara's own eager scheming, rather than her aunt's desperate coercion. Lady Wexford brought the truth to her nephew that same evening, in his study, her expression grim. "You have been played for a fool, Julian," she said, without softening it, "though not by the woman you suspect. Miss Featherstone has spent the better part of this gathering weaving lies designed to separate you from Miss Bennington, and I am ashamed to say they very nearly succeeded, because you were far too ready to believe the worst of a woman who has, by every account I have gathered, shown you nothing but honesty since the moment she arrived." The Duke sat very still, absorbing the weight of what his aunt had told him, the shape of his own error settling over him like cold water. He thought of Clara's face in the library, the hurt and fury in her voice, as she told him she had never asked him to trust her blindly, and he understood, with a clarity that shamed him, that he had done to her precisely what Cordelia's betrayal had taught him to fear most. He had judged her guilty before she had ever been given a fair hearing, simply because judging her guilty was safer than risking his heart on her innocence. "I must speak with her," he said. Rising, "You must do a great deal more than speak with her," Lady Wexford said, though not unkindly. "You must make it right, publicly, if you intend to make it right at all. Because Miss Featherstone did not spread these lies quietly, and Miss Bennington's reputation has suffered for it in whispers, if nothing else. A private apology will not undo public damage." The Duke understood the truth of this even as it settled, heavy and unwelcome, over his plans. There was to be a final ball the following evening, the formal conclusion of the gathering, at which he was expected by his own household, by the assembled families, by the weight of his father's dying wish, to announce his choice. He had intended, before Miranda's lies took root, to use that evening to declare himself to Clara privately first and publicly second, with all the careful tenderness the moment deserved. Now he would have to do something far more difficult and far more exposed. Clara, meanwhile, had resolved to leave. She had spent the night composing and abandoning and recomposing a letter to her aunt, informing Lady Prescott that she would not marry Mr. Barrow, whatever the debt required, and that she intended instead to seek a position as a governess or companion, however diminished such a life might appear beside the fortune her aunt had hoped for. She had packed her single trunk and arranged for a hired carriage to collect her the following morning before the final ball, unwilling to endure one more evening watching the Duke's cold, guarded eyes pass over her, as though the warmth between them had never existed at all. She did not know that Miranda Featherstone, informed by her mother's maid of Lady Wexford's inquiries, had grown desperate enough that morning to attempt one final, reckless act of sabotage, slipping into Clara's room while she was at breakfast and searching, with shaking hands, for anything that might be used against her, until she found, tucked into the lining of Clara's trunk, a single letter from her father, written in the last weeks of his illness, apologizing for the debts he was leaving behind, and begging his daughter's forgiveness for the life of diminished circumstance he feared he was condemning her to. Miranda read the letter with cold, calculating eyes, and understood, with sudden clarity, precisely how to end this contest before the ball ever began. She took the letter to the Duke. "I thought you ought to see this," Miranda said, presenting it to him in the drawing room with an expression of careful, performed reluctance. "Before you make any announcement this evening you might come to regret. I found it quite by accident, Your Grace, among Miss Bennington's belongings, and I confess it troubles me greatly, given what it reveals of her family's true circumstances, and how very motivated she must be to secure whatever offer presents itself first." The Duke took the letter and read it, and as he read, his expression did not shift in the way Miranda had hoped. He read Clara's father's grief, his shame, his desperate love for a daughter he feared he was failing even as he wrote to her. He read, between every careful apologetic line, the shape of the woman Clara had become. Proud despite poverty, honest despite every incentive to dissemble, protective of her father's memory even when that memory had left her burdened rather than blessed. "You searched her belongings," the Duke said quietly, lifting his eyes from the letter to Miranda's face, and something in his gaze made her step back involuntarily. "You entered her private room, without invitation, and took a dying man's letter to his daughter, in the hope of using it to wound her in my eyes." Miranda's confidence faltered for the first time since the gathering began. "I only thought. I know precisely what you thought," the Duke said, and his voice, though quiet, carried an authority that silenced her completely. "You thought that if you could not win me through your own merit, you would win me by destroying hers. You have spent this entire gathering, Miss Featherstone, doing exactly that. The lie about a settled arrangement, the whispers about Mr. Barrow, and now this. I have been slow to see it, and slower still to understand what it has cost Miss Bennington, but I see it now, entirely, and I promise you, it will not go unanswered." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Miranda Featherstone left the drawing-room, white-faced and silent, and the Duke stood alone for a long moment, Clara's father's letter still in his hands, feeling the full weight of his own failure settle over him. The failure to trust the one woman in this entire elaborate, wounded scheme of his own devising who had never once lied to him, not even when honesty cost her everything. He went to find her immediately, and learned, from a maid hurrying down the corridor, that Miss Bennington's trunk had already been carried down to the drive, that a hired carriage stood waiting, that Miss Bennington intended to leave within the hour, before the final ball, before any announcement could be made. He reached the drive just as the carriage door was closing. Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it stopped her hand on the door as surely as if he had caught her wrist. She turned, and found him standing bareheaded in the drive, Rothmere Hall rising grey and vast behind him, her father's letter clutched in his hand, and something in his grey eyes that she had never seen there before. Not the careful composure of a duke conducting an experiment, not the cold, wounded distance of a man who feared he had been fooled again, but something raw and unguarded and entirely undefended. "You cannot leave," he said. Not before I have said what I ought to have said days ago, when I let Miranda Featherstone's lies stand between us, instead of trusting the woman who had given me nothing but honesty since the moment I met her in my own stable yard. "Your Grace, Julian," he said. "My name is Julian, and I would very much like you to use it, because I do not intend to let you climb into that carriage, still believing yourself merely a debt to be settled, by your aunt or by anyone else." He crossed the distance between them, and held out her father's letter, and watched her face crumple, just slightly, with grief and recognition when she saw it in his hand. "Miranda took this from your trunk, hoping to use it against you. Instead, it showed me exactly what I ought to have seen from the very beginning, a man who loved his daughter enough to be ashamed of failing her, and a daughter who has spent every day since carrying that failure with more grace and honesty than anyone I have ever known, including myself. I said terrible things to you," Clara whispered, "in the stable yard, believing you a groom." "You said true things," Julian corrected gently, to a man who had spent 3 years surrounded by people too frightened of his title to ever tell him the truth. "You gave me the one thing no one else in this entire gathering thought to offer, Clara. You gave me yourself. Unrehearsed, unguarded, entirely honest. And I was too wounded by an old betrayal to recognize how rare a gift that was, until I very nearly lost it." Clara felt tears rise, hot and unstoppable now, and did not try to stop them. "My aunt will not release me from the debt," she said. "There is still Mr. Barrow, still the arrangement, still there is nothing," Julian said firmly, "that a dukedom's resources cannot resolve. If the woman at the center of it is willing to let me help her carry a burden she has carried alone for far too long. I am not offering to settle your aunt's debt because I pity you, Clara. I am offering because I love you, and because a man who loves a woman does not stand by and watch her be sold to a stranger in Ashcombe, when he has both the means and the will to prevent it." The word love hung between them in the cool afternoon air, and Clara felt the whole weight of the gathering, the humiliations and the hopes, and the careful, guarded distance of the past days, dissolve into something entirely new. "You tested 50 women," she said, half laughing through her tears, "for honesty, and it was the 51st who nearly walked away from you entirely." "The 51st, Julian said, drawing her hand into his, "was never truly a candidate at all. Clara, she was simply the answer, arriving a day early, before I even knew I was asking the question." That evening's ball proceeded, though its purpose had shifted entirely from what the assembled guests expected. Julian stood before the same gallery of ancestral portraits where he had first addressed his 50 ladies, and this time Clara stood beside him, not among the assembled candidates but at his side, where, he announced, to the visible fury of Miranda Featherstone and the stunned murmurs of the wider company, she would remain for the whole of their lives together. He spoke, too, of Miranda's lies, with a careful precision that left no doubt of what had occurred, ensuring that whatever whispers followed the gathering into the wider world would carry the truth of Clara's dignity rather than the poison Miranda had tried to plant. Lady Featherstone, mortified, withdrew her daughter from the hall before the evening's end, and though Miranda's scheming would follow her in quiet gossip for seasons afterward, it never again found purchase against Clara Bennington, who stood that night, not as a debt settled or a duty discharged, but as a woman chosen, entirely and openly, for exactly who she was. Lady Prescott arrived within the week, summoned by news that travelled faster than any letter could, and found her niece transformed, not merely by the promise of a duke's fortune, though that promise would in time settle every debt her father had left behind, but by something Lady Prescott had not expected to see in the girl she had raised more from obligation than affection. A quiet, unshakable certainty that she had been loved, not despite her circumstances, but entirely apart from them. "You have done well for yourself," Lady Prescott said, in the same brisk tone she might have used to discuss a successful transaction, and Clara, standing in the doorway of a home that would soon be hers, found she no longer had the capacity to be wounded by it. "I have been loved well," she corrected gently. "Which is not quite the same thing, Aunt, though I understand you may not currently agree it is a meaningful difference." The wedding, when it came, was smaller than the grand spectacle Rothmere Hall's staff had expected, held in the estate's old stone chapel rather than in London's fashionable churches, attended by Susanna Hale, who wept openly through the entire ceremony, and by Lady Wexford, who pronounced herself thoroughly satisfied with an outcome she had privately engineered from the very first evening. She suspected her nephew's heart had already been claimed. Julian stood at the altar in the same steady, unhurried manner Clara remembered from the stable yard, and when she walked toward him in a gown considerably finer than the one grey dress she had worn through every trial of the gathering, he watched her with an expression the assembled guests would later describe, in hushed and admiring tones, as a man who had found something he had stopped believing existed. "I once told you," Clara whispered, as they stood together after the ceremony, the chapel's old stone walls warm with afternoon light, "that I would rather remain unmarried my whole life than curtsy for a man who could not be bothered to court me properly." "And did I court you properly in the end?" Julian asked, drawing her closer. "You tested 50 women to find me," Clara said, laughing now, the old bitterness gone entirely from her voice, replaced by something warm and certain and hers alone. "I do not know that any woman has ever been courted quite so strangely, Your Grace. But I would not change a single moment of it, not the stable yard, nor the storm in the orangery, nor even Miranda Featherstone's lies, because every strange, difficult step of it led me here, to a man who chose me not for my fortune, since I had none, nor for my beauty, since there were fairer women in that gallery, but simply for the truth of who I was, unguarded and entirely my own." "That," Julian said softly, pressing a kiss to her hand, "was the only test that ever mattered." They spent that first evening of their marriage walking the gardens together, past the stables where a groom's disguise had first brought them face to face, past the orangery where a summer storm had taught them both to speak honestly of grief, past the library where anger and honesty had nearly torn them apart and, in the end, had bound them together more firmly than any careful courtship ever could have. Clara thought of her father's letter, tucked now safely among her most treasured possessions rather than a weapon in another woman's hand, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in her chest, that he would have been glad, not for the dukedom, not for the fortune that would settle every debt he had left behind, but for the simple, hard-won truth that his daughter had been loved, at last, exactly as she was, by a man who had tested 50 ladies and found, in the 51st, everything he had stopped believing he deserved to find at all. And so the story that travelled through the county in the seasons that followed, softened and reshaped, as all good stories are in the retelling, was not, in the end, a story of a duke's cold arithmetic, 50 ladies weighed and measured like horses at market. It became, instead, the story the servants told in the kitchens and the mothers told their daughters at bedtime. That honesty, however unfashionable, however dangerous in a world built on careful performance, had once walked into a stable yard believing itself unseen, and had been seen after all, entirely and completely, by the one man whose gaze mattered most. It became a story of a woman who dared to speak the truth to a stranger she believed beneath her notice, and found, in the end, that the truth had been worth far more than any careful, rehearsed performance could ever have purchased. A dukedom. Yes, but more than that, a marriage built not on duty or fortune, or the desperate arithmetic of unpaid debts, but on the rare, unguarded honesty of two wounded hearts, who had finally, against every careful expectation, dared to trust each other completely. And on quiet evenings at Rothmere, long after the 50 ladies had scattered back to their own lives and their own eventual marriages, long after Miranda Featherstone's schemes had faded into half-remembered gossip, and Lady Prescott's debts had been settled and forgotten, Clara would sometimes walk down to the stables alone at dusk, and find her husband there, sleeves rolled as they had been on the very first evening, speaking low and steady to some new horse, who did not yet know him, and she would lean against the same fence rail where she had once mistaken a duke for a groom, and think that she had never, in the whole of her life, been more grateful for a single misunderstanding. "You are staring," Julian would say without turning, the echo of her own long-ago words returning to her with a warmth that had nothing left in it of the fear or grief that first evening had carried. "I am staring," Clara would agree, "at a man who tested 50 ladies for a bride, and never once suspected that the 51st would be the one to test him back, and find him, against every expectation, entirely worth the winning." And he would cross the small distance between them, and take her hand, and the old stone hall behind them would glow gold in the fading light, holding within its walls at last not 50 candidates, and a cold, careful experiment, but a single hard-won love that neither title nor fortune, nor any careful arithmetic of debts and duties had ever been strong enough to purchase. Only honesty had managed that, freely given, on an ordinary evening, to a man in shirt-sleeves who had never once stopped being, in every way that mattered, exactly who he claimed not to be,